Richard Bennett pointed a trembling finger across the hospital waiting room. That little girl isn't part of this family. Every conversation stopped. The television mounted on the wall kept playing the afternoon news, but no one looked at it anymore. Every pair of eyes turned toward 6-year-old Lily, who stood beside me clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd carried since she was 3. She looked up at me, confused. "Moms, what does Grandpa mean?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. Richard folded his arms with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged in his own family. "I've kept quiet long enough," he said loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Blood matters, and today we're finally going to find out the truth." My husband, Daniel, stared at his father as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. "Dad, stop." "No," Richard snapped, "not this time." Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. One aunt slowly stepped away from where Lily was standing. My sister-in-law lowered her eyes and said nothing. No one defended us. I felt every stare land on my face, silently asking the same question Richard wanted everyone to ask. Had I lied to this family for years? I reached down and squeezed Lily's hand. "We are not doing this in front of her." Richard gave a cold laugh. "The truth doesn't wait for convenience." Daniel took one step toward his father but hesitated. His entire life, Richard had been the loudest voice in every room. Even now, at 34 years old, Daniel looked trapped between protecting his wife and confronting the man who had raised him. Then the waiting room doors opened. A nurse walked in carrying a sealed envelope and a patient file. Before anyone could speak, she looked around the room and said, "Before anyone leaves, there's something all of you need to hear." The room remained frozen. Richard straightened his jacket as though he'd been expecting this moment for weeks. Instead of looking nervous, he almost looked satisfied. "Go ahead," he said, "let's settle this." I couldn't understand it. If these were the lab results from the compatibility testing Daniel had undergone during his recent medical emergency, why was Richard acting like he already knew what they would say? Daniel looked from his father to me. "I never wanted any DNA testing," he said quietly. "Dad insisted after the doctors mentioned compatibility." I nodded. I remembered that conversation. The doctors had explained they needed additional testing because of Daniel's treatment. Somehow Richard had pushed for extra genetic confirmation, claiming it would clear up family records. At the time, I thought he was simply being controlling. Now I wasn't so sure. Richard had never fully accepted me after Daniel and I married. He came from old money, loved talking about the Bennett family legacy, and believed every generation had a duty to protect the family name. Lily had paid the price for that belief. He refused to display pictures that included her in his study. During family holidays, he always found excuses to leave her out of old Bennett traditions. Whenever someone commented that Lily had Daniel's smile, Richard would dismiss it with a shrug. "I don't see it." Each moment had been small enough to ignore. Together, they painted a picture I had tried not to see. Now those years of quiet insults had exploded into one public accusation. The nurse glanced between each family member before looking back at the envelope in her hands. "I need everyone to remain here until I verify the identities connected to these results." Richard smiled. I watched Daniel instead. He wasn't angry with me. He wasn't suspicious. He looked completely confused. That frightened me more than Richard's accusation ever could. Because if Daniel didn't know why his father was so certain, then what exactly was Richard expecting those lab results to reveal? Daniel leaned closer to me while the nurse checked the names on the paperwork. "Emma," he whispered, "whatever happens, I need you to know something." I searched his face. "I never asked for any of this." Before I could answer, the nurse looked up. "I have to confirm everyone's identity before discussing these results. It'll only take a few minutes." Those few minutes felt endless. Lily climbed onto the chair beside me and rested her head against my arm, unaware of why the adults around her had suddenly become so quiet. I stroked her hair, trying to hide the shaking in my hand. Richard remained standing across the room, watching us without a hint of sympathy. His expression pulled me back through years of memories. The first Christmas after Lily was born, Richard insisted on taking a Bennett family portrait. Just before the picture was taken, he'd smiled at me and said, "Maybe Emma can hold the camera." At Thanksgiving, he'd invited every grandchild to help carve the turkey, except Lily. Whenever relatives commented that Lily had Daniel's eyes, Richard would simply say, "Children can resemble anyone." Each slight had been easy to dismiss on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Daniel sighed heavily. "I should have stood up to him years ago." "You always defended Lily," I said quietly. "Only when he wasn't around. That wasn't enough." I remembered the nights Daniel would tuck Lily into bed after family gatherings. "Grandpa just has trouble showing love," he'd tell her. Now even he sounded like he no longer believed those words. The nurse continued reviewing the documents, while Richard waited with unsettling confidence. No packing. No nervous questions. Just certainty. I looked at Daniel again. "If you never wanted these tests," I asked, "why did your father push so hard for them?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "I don't know." Across the room, Richard caught our eyes and gave the faintest smile, as though he was waiting for something inevitable. How could he be so certain before anyone had even opened the report? Richard broke the silence before the nurse could continue. "There's no reason to drag this out," he announced, raising his voice so everyone in the waiting room could hear. "If those results show what I believe they will, Emma should do the decent thing and leave this family." Several people nearby turned to look. Even strangers waiting for appointments paused to watch. "Richard, that's enough," Daniel said, stepping between his father and us. Richard barely acknowledged him. "You've spent years defending her, now you'll finally have proof." Emma felt Lily grip her hand tighter. "Mom," Lily whispered, "can we go home?" Emma knelt beside her. "Soon, sweetheart." One of Daniel's cousins cleared his throat but said nothing. Another relative quietly moved closer to Richard, as if expecting him to be right. The family was beginning to split before anyone had seen a single result. The nurse unfolded the paperwork and frowned. "Excuse me," she said, scanning another page. "There's an additional notation attached to this testing." Richard's confidence faltered for the first time. "What notation?" he asked quickly. "I need to review this carefully." He took a step toward her. "Just read the results." "I will," the nurse replied calmly, "but there are two separate genetic findings connected to these records." The room fell silent again. Emma noticed the nurse had stopped looking at the page labeled with Lily's information. Instead, her eyes were fixed on Daniel's file. Daniel frowned. "My file?" "Yes," the nurse answered. Richard interrupted before she could continue. "That can't be relevant." The nurse looked up at him with a puzzled expression. "It is relevant." The relatives who had been staring at Emma slowly shifted their attention toward Daniel, and then toward Richard. Something had changed. This was no longer just about Lily. The nurse carefully closed the folder for a moment and looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Bennett," she said quietly, "this result isn't about your granddaughter." Daniel stared at the nurse. "What do you mean it isn't about Lily?" Before she could answer, Richard stepped forward so quickly that one of the chairs scraped loudly across the floor. "Those results are wrong," he said. "Run the test again." The nurse remained composed. "Sir, the laboratory has already completed multiple verification procedures. That's standard protocol whenever an unexpected genetic discrepancy appears." "I don't care about protocol," Richard snapped. "Repeat it." "I'm afraid there's no indication of a testing error." For the first time since this ordeal began, Richard looked rattled. The certainty that had carried him through every accusation began to crack. The nurse turned to another member of the hospital staff. "Could you bring the archived records linked to Mr. Daniel Bennett's file? There's an older notation that needs to be reviewed alongside these results." The staff member nodded and disappeared through the hallway doors. Daniel looked from the nurse to his father. What older notation? Richard didn't answer. Minutes later, a thick medical folder was placed on the counter. The nurse carefully opened it, reading several pages in silence. Daniel's Aunt Susan suddenly frowned. I haven't thought about this in years. Everyone turned toward her. There were arguments, she said slowly, after Daniel was born. Richard shot her a warning look. Susan, this isn't the time. She ignored him. Your mother and Richard used to disappear into another room and argue for hours. Whenever anyone asked what was wrong, they'd say it was stress from the pregnancy. Daniel blinked. I never knew that. None of us did, Susan admitted. Your mother wouldn't talk about it. Emma's heart began connecting pieces she hadn't understood before. Richard hadn't just questioned Lily. He had spent Daniel's entire life obsessed with proving bloodlines. The comments, the distance, the impossible standards. They suddenly seemed aimed at Daniel long before Emma had ever entered the family. Richard turned toward the exit. I'm finished with this. He took only 2 steps before Daniel moved in front of him. No. The single word echoed through the waiting room. Richard looked stunned. Daniel had never stood in his way before. You don't get to walk out after humiliating my wife and frightening my daughter, Daniel said. You're staying until we hear every word. The relatives who had silently supported Richard moments earlier now looked at him with growing suspicion. One cousin spoke up. Richard, why were you so determined to have Daniel tested in the first place? Another added, you acted like you already knew something. Richard looked around the room but offered no explanation. For the first time in years, no one rushed to defend him. The power he had always held over the family was slipping away. The nurse picked up the final verified report, took a steady breath, and looked directly at Daniel. I can now explain everything. The nurse placed the report on the table instead of handing it to anyone. I know this is an emotional situation, she said gently, so I want to explain these findings as clearly as possible. No one spoke. She looked at Daniel first. Mr. Bennett, the genetic testing confirms that Lily is your biological daughter. The words seemed to hang in the air. Emma closed her eyes for a brief moment as relief washed over her. Daniel let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Richard said nothing. The nurse continued. The unexpected finding has nothing to do with Lily. It concerns your relationship with Mr. Richard Bennett. Daniel frowned. My relationship. The testing shows that Mr. Richard Bennett is not your biological father. Silence. Complete silence. Richard's face drained of color. Emma instinctively wrapped an arm around Lily, who looked from one adult to another without understanding why everyone had stopped moving. Daniel stared at the nurse. That can't be right. The nurse opened the older medical file. Years ago, your mother requested additional medical reviews after inconsistencies appeared in records related to fertility treatment before your birth. Those reviews suggested a fertility clinic error had occurred. She paused to let the information settle. Your mother privately investigated the matter. She learned that Richard Bennett was not your biological father. According to these records, she chose not to disclose the information because she believed preserving her family would spare everyone further pain. Daniel lowered his head. My mother knew. According to the documents, yes. The nurse closed the folder. It also appears Mr. Bennett later became aware of those records. Every eye turned toward Richard. His shoulders sagged. Emma finally understood. Richard hadn't spent years questioning Lily because he had evidence against Emma. He had spent years trying to prove that someone else had deceived the family the way he believed his own life had deceived him. His obsession with bloodlines had become an obsession with finding another lie. Instead, the testing had exposed the truth he had spent years trying to outrun. Daniel looked directly at his father. So that's why. Richard didn't answer. You kept pushing for proof because you couldn't accept what happened. Still nothing. You punished me my whole life because of something I never had anything to do with. Richard slowly sat down. For the first time anyone could remember, he had no argument. No lecture. No command. Only silence. Emma felt Lily tug gently on her sleeve. Mom, did I do something wrong? Emma knelt until they were eye level. No, sweetheart. She brushed a strand of hair away from Lily's face. You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is because of you. Lily looked at Daniel. Daddy, are we still a family? Daniel dropped to one knee and hugged her tightly. We always were. Lily wrapped both arms around his neck. I was scared. I know, he whispered, but nobody gets to decide you're not my daughter, nobody. Several relatives wiped away tears. Daniel's aunt walked over to Emma first. I'm sorry. Emma looked up. I should have spoken when Richard started accusing you. I let him control this family for too long. Others followed. One by one, relatives apologized for assuming Richard must have been telling the truth simply because he spoke with certainty. No one stood beside him anymore. The man who had once dominated every family gathering now sat completely alone. Daniel turned toward his father one last time. I spent my whole life trying to earn your approval. Richard looked up but couldn't meet his son's eyes. I don't need it anymore. He took Emma's hand. Then Lily's. We're leaving. Richard finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel. Daniel stopped but didn't turn around. When you're ready to accept responsibility for what you did to my wife and my daughter, you can reach out. He paused. Until then, we're done. Months passed. Family gatherings looked different. Without Richard controlling every conversation, people laughed more freely. The discussions about inheritance and family decisions no longer revolved around his approval. Other relatives took responsibility together, and no one allowed old habits of fear and silence to return. Emma noticed something else had changed. No one questioned whether Lily belonged. She was included in every family photo. She helped decorate holiday tables. She sat beside her cousins without feeling like an outsider. Daniel carried himself differently too. The weight of spending decades chasing impossible approval was gone. He focused on being the father Lily deserved, instead of the son Richard demanded. On Lily's 7th birthday, the backyard was filled with balloons, cake, cousins, and laughter. Emma watched Daniel help Lily blow out her candles, while relatives cheered around them. For the first time since joining the Bennett family, she felt no need to prove herself. She simply belonged. As Lily ran across the yard laughing with the family that had finally embraced her, Emma smiled. Knowing the truth hadn't broken their family, it had revealed who truly belonged in it.